Somewhere in the deep, dark bowels of Britain's prison system lurks the definition of viciousness. A man who takes comfort in violence. Brutalised and isolated by the system, he is segregated from the rest of humanity for their own safety. But with the violence, there are glimmers of brilliance. Creative excellence trapped in the isolation of his own making. A showman creating majestic madness from beautifully bizarre brutality and chaos. A man imprisoned for life for causing a reign of terror within the hardest prisons in the UK. He has been deemed too dangerous to live on the streets, even though he has never committed murder and is now an old man. This is the story of Charles Bronson, Britain's most dangerous prisoner. A story so complex, bizarre and violent, it inspired a movie. This movie would give Tom Hardy his big break as a leading actor, and arguably his greatest acting performance to date. Charles Bronson was born Michael Peterson in 1952, and he had a fairly normal upbringing in Luton. Unlike many violent criminals, he was well looked after by his family, and nothing in his childhood can explain his mentality. One trait he shared with other psychopaths is that he wet the bed until the age of 10. This is a trait strikingly common amongst serial killers.
So the first three are referred to as the MacDonald triad, and I've seen all three of these, and they do seem to have a connection to psychopathy, but again, they're no guarantee. The first one is bedwetting.
The famous triad of bedwetting is.
He also suffered a head injury at the age of 8 when his mother accidentally hit him over the head whilst cooking. Again, this is a trait amongst serial killers and psychopathic criminals.
And I'm going to show you what happens in the brain of a psychopath. A psychopath's brain, and Dr. Oz, you can ring right in here with me at any point. You were talking about it on your show today. Their prefrontal cortex is thinner, it's under-functioning, it doesn't work as well.
Brain damage can severely limit impulse control and fear.
In sports, including boxing and football, traumatic brain injury has been linked to a condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Symptoms include memory loss, impulse control problems, and depression.
From his own words, he first got the urge to kill at the age of 13 and began planning violent attacks. He hid in wait behind a tree for someone to come down the street so he could attack them with a bottle. When no one came, he smashed it over his own head. Consultant psychiatrist Cleo Van Velsen speculated that his violent tendencies may have been a coping mechanism to deal with feelings of vulnerability and humiliation. Bronson certainly was shy and introverted. He was constantly trying to prove himself as number one to his friends. After his older brother joined the Royal Marine Band, he also felt like a disappointment in the family. Whilst his brother was praised, he was getting expelled from school, stealing from shops and getting into police chases on stolen motorbikes. After leaving school, his first job was in Tesco, but after 2 weeks he battered the manager with a price stamping gun after he humiliated him. This was pretty much how his working career turned out. He would get a job, making a bit of money, go out drinking at the weekend, get fired and repeat the process. He was barred from nearly every pub and club around Ellesmere Port where he was staying at the time, and he was constantly paying off fines for petty crime. He also began to do short stints in prison. In truth, his criminal career was a laughable mess. Devoid of any planning or intellect, he impulsively committed armed robbery. At the age of 19, he had a comfortable life, was married had a baby boy, a council house, a car, and was earning good money as a self-employed painter. But he threw it all away to chase the thrill of crime. He robbed a small post office in Merseyside in 1974, escaping with a measly £26. But little did he know at the time just how much this failed robbery would cost him. This event would spark a chain of events which would put him behind bars for the rest of his life, making him, to this day, Britain's longest serving prisoner. His imprisonment is a highly debated topic in the British justice system. His treatment by the establishment may well have created the caged animal he became. Paranoid and violently impulsive, he would react savagely to the slightest perceived threat or insult. He was first locked up in Risley Remand Centre, a prison nicknamed Grizzly Risley, as at the time it had the highest rate of suicide in any prison. And although the prison was newly built in the 60s, it was not built with toilet facilities in the cells. Prisoners would have to use buckets at night when going to the toilet, then empty them in the morning. This was a term known as slopping out, a process that led to one of the largest prison riots in British history. Charlie states that prisoners would even be forced to go to the toilet inside a newspaper and throw it out of the window to save them smelling their own human waste throughout the night. The cells, which were a tiny 8-foot square circumference, were built for one, but were often overcrowded with prisoners. He also claims giant rats would lurk in the grounds of the prison, bigger than cats, and that it was infested with cockroaches. He began to feel dehumanised with the conditions, and he wanted vengeance. Soon after his wife left him, he broke an inmate's nose and ribs. Then 2 days later, he attacked a snitch. He assaulted prison guards as well, and would often smash up the premises if he felt he was being wronged. One of the first riots he caused was in a workshop which he tore to shreds. After launching a pole at an officer, they piled on him, beating him. Bronson claims one of the guards even squeezed his testicles to inflict maximum pain. He was later strapped up in a body belt in the punishment block. This is where he was first given an injection to sedate him. It was also around this time he attempted his first escape. He was caught almost immediately, and he began to accrue more and more time on his sentence. In his anger and madness, he would harvest weapons whenever he could to maim and wound both prisoners and guards. He smashed a jug off and continued to assault a prisoner with the broken pieces. This was over an argument when a prisoner kept banging his ceiling. According to Bronson, this man later killed 4 people, so it's hard to give him any sympathy. He also began a Spartan-like fitness regime, growing in size by the day to bear-like proportions. His fitness feats are the stuff of legend, and he has even written a prison fitness manual called Solitary Fitness. For an example of his feats, he claimed that he managed to complete 1,727 press-ups in 1 hour. He claimed in his book that even though he hadn't touched weights in 8 years, he was able to bench press 300 pounds for 10 reps. Some publications, such as the Sun newspaper, state that he holds 6 unofficial world records in strength and fitness. And as his muscles grew, so did his reputation and infamy. he began to be known as Britain's most dangerous prisoner, a title that brought him a tremendous amount of pride and attention. Reveling in his reputation, he would add a touch of flair to his appearance. He would shave his head bald, leaving a Salvador Dali-esque barber moustache on his face. An artist he would later emulate in his surrealist depictions of life in solitary confinement. It seemed the failed criminal and ordinary civilian Michael Peterson became a superstar prisoner as Charles Bronson. He built his persona with every attack. But his reputation would cost him dearly. Those in power began to believe he was uncontrollable, unmanageable, and unreformable. And after losing contact with his wife and son, he no longer had anything on the outside world to go back to. His life was behind bars, and his mission was destruction. He was placed in solitary confinement, locked away from other prisoners. The only people he would see on a daily basis were those charged with looking after him. And from behind his cell door, he would wage war against the prison guards and the entire prison system. Later on, whilst lying in a bloody mess on his cell floor after a beating by the guards, a letter was slung through the door. It was his divorce papers. The guards laughed at him and told him, "Even your missus don't want you." Bronson was treated as a subhuman in prison. He was regularly beaten by prison guards and tranquilized like a zoo animal with the liquid kosh. This was an antipsychotic tranquilizer that was forcibly used to control prisoners. It would cause debilitating side effects, including painful muscular spasms and swelling of the tongue. Quoting Charles Bronson, "I believe it was a large dose of Largactil. Knocked me out, but the side effects were even worse. Stiffness, muscular spasms, dryness of the mouth, blurry vision. It lingered for days." In 1978, he was declared insane after committing 200 acts of violence in 4 years. On one particular occasion, he had some trouble with his neighbouring cellmate. Bronson crushed up glass and put it into sugar, which he gave to him. This had him urinating blood, and he was sent to the hospital wing. During his time at Parkhurst Prison, he also befriended the notorious Cray twins. By and large, this visit to Parkhurst was a positive experience for him. He worked out with the twins and other inmates and was treated well by the guards. But before long, he was away to another prison. Charlie states that at one time he had a mental breakdown in prison. He was diagnosed with epilepsy, and a forensic psychologist called Dr. Falk said he was psychopathic and paranoid. After smashing a jam jar into another prisoner's face, he fell into a depression. He attempted to take his own life with a razor blade on the wrist. Later, after assaulting medical staff, he was beaten and sedated to be taken to court. He was to be sent to Rampton Secure Hospital. He was certified insane and sectioned under the Mental Health Act. In Rampton, any hopes of a therapeutic sentence were dashed when 6 burly hospital assistants met him at the gate. After a fight broke out, he was stripped and thrown into a cold bath. He was also further subjugated to forced injections after refusing to take his meds. This only fueled his vengeance at the system. He said his time there was spent in a chemical-induced daze, walking around zombified. He was surrounded by deluded patients who had lost all control of reality. One patient thought he was the Pope. He was also surrounded by criminals of the lowest order, those that hurt children. This is where he first tried to kill someone intentionally. A nonce and child killer named John White. Much like in the movie, he strangled him from behind with a tie in the day room. But he was stopped and dragged back to his cell. He was later sent to the notorious Broadmoor Mental Hospital, England's answer to Arkham Asylum, a place Bronson would call a monster's paradise. This was also the first and only place that scared him. He was surrounded by unpredictable violence, was given even more extreme medication, and witnessed gruesome acts of self-harm by deranged inmates. The criminal code also didn't apply in Broadmoor, as many patients with limited IQ would tell on people like they were school children. After trying to strangle a man who attempted to steal from him, he was locked in isolation for the next 4 years. From behind his door he would plan his revolt, entering into an extreme fitness regimen to handle the physicality of it. In 1982 he broke free and climbed onto the roof of Broadmoor to protest his conditions. He climbed up a drain pipe after shimmying along a beam and jumping onto the outside of a cell window. This was the first time anyone in Britain had done this in 100 years. From here he began to rip the roof apart. He used his incredible strength to obliterate the roof, ripping off tiles, electrical wires, timber and copper. Charlie felt this was payback for years of suffering in the system. To quote from his book, "Every slate I slung off that roof represented a day of my life caged up." And when he finally climbed down, a defeated man, he had developed pleurisy. When he recovered, he again repeated defeat, this time having the run of 2 roofs instead of 1. It was chaos. He again ripped the roof to shreds. Female inmates were loving the show and flashed him out of the windows, whilst he darted about with bats and even an owl flying by. He states that in his hunger he even ate pigeon eggs and moss out of a gutter to survive. Eventually, after 3 nights, his brother and father convinced him to come down. It is estimated that he had caused almost £250,000 worth of damage. Bronson would later earn the unofficial record of the inmate with the most prison rooftop protests. It was after this that he began writing and drawing. His signature caricatures would later garner serious critical acclaim. Next, after having his parole denied, he was again back on the roof to protest. This time he was convinced to come down after his request to move to a different hospital was accepted, or at least it seemed that way. But after this turned out to be a lie, he went on hunger strike, and for 18 days his powerful body began to wither away. After over 2 weeks his demands were met and he was moved to Park Lane. Here he had a pleasant time, and the rehabilitative culture of Park Lane really seemed to calm him. He was preparing for parole and kept his temper even when faced with enemies from the past. But when a male inmate made a pass at him, he went mental. An inmate wrote him a dirty love letter and wolf whistled him when he was exercising. The next time Bronson saw him, he hit him in the face with a bottle. He then smashed up his cell and took an inmate hostage so he could phone his cousin. Next, he was shipped back to Risley Remand Centre, and he was quickly back to his usual stunts, assaulting people for minor infractions. He was even jumped and dragged out of his cell through the hatch by 6 Scousers. He took out his anger by climbing onto the roof and obliterating it. And after he had caused £100,000 worth of damage, and after his demands for fish and chips were met, he climbed down. Months later, he would also be declared sane after a mental health tribunal. He later found himself back in Parkhurst, where a minor incident meant he would be in solitary confinement until the day he was released. According to Bronson, he open-hand slapped a prisoner who had disrespected him. This prisoner snitched on him, and this gave him little chance of rehabilitation or a chance to become socialised with people before his release. He buckled down and was relatively well behaved until he was finally released in 1987. He had spent nearly 14 years behind bars. 11 more years than he was expected to serve. He was too dangerous to mix with regular prisoners, but was deemed safe to be released that year. He was also promised an unlicensed boxing bout upon his release. After spending 3 days with his mother and father in Aberystwyth, he left to move to London. Symbolic of his lack of rehabilitation, he didn't know how to use the new coins that had came in, and couldn't use a telephone or a microwave. But his sights were set on becoming an unlicensed boxing star. He arranged a fight in East London, then using a water pistol, hijacked a car, making the driver take him to Luton to his Uncle Jack's house. He was instantly attracted to the world of boxing. His father was a Royal Navy boxing champion and his uncle was involved in the sport. So it was a natural progression for him to take up fighting. He had mixed with the faces of the underworld and the bare-knuckle boxing circuit. And after Reggie Cray convinced him in jail, he knew this was the path he wanted to take. This is how he would meet bare-knuckle boxing promoter Paul Edmonds, who gave him his fighting name, Charles Bronson, after the action movie star. He would later be forged into a savage fighter in garages and warehouses all over England, beating men into a bloody pulp behind closed doors for money. As fight footage shows, he was a clumsy, unskilled fighter when limited to boxing gloves and a rule book. But his raw aggression, power and inability to feel fear and absolute lack of empathy made him unstoppable in the bare-knuckle realm of no-holds-barred fighting. He claims that an offer was made to Lenny the Governor McLean, perhaps Britain's most well-known bare-knuckle and unlicensed boxer at the time. This was not accepted for unknown reasons. But tantamount to the animal he had become, Bronson would fight and defeat a Rottweiler dog in a warehouse fight. He had some moderate success, but when the riches never materialised, he went back to robbing. He also wanted to surprise a young woman called Alison he had been seeing with a present. He held up a jewellery store for around £1,000 and was quickly arrested. Some have speculated that this half-hearted robbery was an attempt to be re-arrested as he couldn't cope with the outside world. He only managed 69 days on the outside. He was given 7 years after Alison betrayed him and told the police it was him that robbed the jewellers. He was quickly back to his old ways in prison with a brief escape to the roof. He also bashed an IRA member on the wing of a secure unit. His aggression was increasing. He now took to painting his whole body black with boot polish before he took on the prison guards. This was like his war paint. On one occasion, he crafted a spear using a stick and a glass bottle and charged at prison officers who fled. He had free range of the wing and began ripping it to pieces until the riot guard stopped him. He did this again minus the paint after a prisoner had hurt himself. Bronson and other prisoners had warned guards that he may try and hurt himself, but they didn't listen. This time he made it onto the nonce wing and began bashing any of them he could find out of their cells. He also unleashed a new weapon on the prison system when he began taking hostages. He kidnapped the Deputy Governor of Parkhurst in 1990 but released him shortly after when his friends convinced him that it wasn't worth the extra jail time. For this, he was let off with a caution. This caution was his final warning, a last chance to turn his behaviour around. And in reading Bronson's story, you can't help but root for him despite it all. You are mentally cheering for him to walk away from violence so he can gain his freedom and live a normal, pain-free existence. But it seems he is either incapable or unwilling to do it. In his own admission, he has been given many chances to change and ruined them all. Charlie even managed to save a couple of prisoners' lives. He stopped one from cutting his wrist and he saved another from a fire. He used his impressive strength to boot a cell door down when the cell caught fire. But with every inch he has been given, he has taken a mile. Weeks later, he ruined this by battering a couple of officers. Next, in a fit of rage whilst shaving, he ran out of his cell naked and took a senior officer hostage. For a short while, he barricaded the two of them up in an office before releasing him. And with every stretch of isolation, he would become more and more paranoid when he was finally allowed on a shared wing. He would continually go on one-man wrecking missions in prison and assault prisoners and staff alike. He also narrowly escaped being murdered in prison. Bronson had been given permission to build a pond for the prison when two inmates stuck knives in his back from behind. It was not long after this, in November 1992, he would get another taste of freedom. He was released again into the real world. But after spending Christmas with his family, he was back in jail for punching up a love rival. He was also fitted up with what he alleged were trumped up charges of conspiracy to rob a bank and possession of a firearm. Bronson claimed Kelly Ann, the girl he was seeing, set him up and told police he had a gun, only to retract the statement a week later. After these charges were proven to be false, he was once again released a free man on February 1993. 16 days later, he was rearrested on nearly identical charges. False charges, according to Bronson. But rather than wait for his trial in peace, he would take his frustrations out on the system by grabbing another hostage. He grabbed a member of the library staff named Andy Love.
Andy Love. Oh, Andy Love.
And held him in his cell. He demanded a blow-up doll as ransom and told negotiators he wanted to marry her in Broadmoor Asylum. Bronson claimed that he kicked Andy out of his cell to freedom after he farted and stank up the place. When his trial finally came, he claimed he wasn't intending on robbing a bank, but instead intended on ending his life with the weapon he was caught with. His supposed accomplice was forced to drive to Kelly Ann's house, where Bronson intended to end it all in front of her. He was sent down for another 10 years for intent to rob and possession of a firearm. He narrowly escaped a life sentence after he was found not guilty of 2 other charges. His first act of madness was taking the Deputy Governor of Hull Prison hostage, tying him up and barricading the 2 of them inside a TV room. He demanded a blow-up doll again, along with steak, chips and hot tea. He also stole his captor's walkie-talkie and sang "I Believe" at the top of his lungs to the other guards. Ultimately, he was overpowered and thrown back into isolation. He was later moved to Wakefield, into what he and the British media described as the Hannibal Cage. This was the only cell of its kind in the UK prison system. The cell is completely self-contained and isolated. It has its own shower, so the prisoner cannot even leave the cell to wash. Meals are placed inside the self-contained unit, so the prisoner does not have to leave or speak to anyone when collecting food. One wall of the cell is covered by bulletproof glass so that he can be observed at all times. He was given plastic cutlery, his chair and desk were made out of cardboard, and his bed was bolted to the floor to stop him causing any damage. But, like his bed, his hostage taking bolted any chance of freedom to the floor. Any movement on this position would take a tremendous amount of pressure. After being given the chance to help, train and look after learning disabled children, he started to excel. However, when boredom set in, he kidnapped a doctor named Dr. Wilson. Next, in September 1996, in an act I can't help but smile about, he kidnapped 3 Iraqi hijackers and held them hostage in his cell. He forced one of the hijackers to tickle his feet whilst he sang "O Come All Ye Faithful." If he didn't, he would break their back. They did what they were asked. He also told the guards that he would eat one of the Iraqis if he didn't get a cup of tea. Luckily, one of the guards eventually convinced him to give up before he could do any more damage. Nobody was safe from his hostage taking, but he finally put the nail in his own coffin in 1998 when he held an art teacher hostage. He was doing well and back on a wing, out of isolation, with 5 years left to serve, when the teacher criticised his artwork. Phil Danielson was the teacher, and he was set upon, tied up and put on the snooker table of the prison. Meanwhile, Bronson smashed it to pieces and made a barricade around them. Bronson states that he ripped a washing machine off the wall in the utility room that sent him 10 feet across the room with an electric shock. But even this didn't stop him. In celebration of Vincent van Gogh, he asked Danielson to cut his ear off so he could bury it with his dying grandmother. He would not be allowed to see her, so at least a piece of him would go with her. However, he soon backed out of the idea and made a makeshift spear. Then he tied a skipping rope around Danielson's neck and took him for a walk like a pet dog. The siege lasted for 44 hours, which was the largest prison siege in UK history at that point. After this, all his privileges were taken away. He wasn't even allowed a toothbrush or his art materials. The one thing that gave him peace and happiness was taken away, and even then he fought back. He went on hunger strike lasting 40 days. From there he remained in isolation. In his own words, he admits, "I've dug my own hole and they now seem determined to bury me in it." From his siege, he was given a discretionary life sentence, meaning he may not see life on the outside ever again. Since then, it seems age has calmed him slightly. He has had his parole rejected twice so far, in 2004 and 2009. In 2009, Tom Hardy executed a tremendous portrayal of his life in the film Bronson. In 2014, he attacked the governor of Woodhill Prison. He has had a miserable life of his own making. In his years as a prisoner, it came to the point where he had to be escorted by at least 6 riot-armed guards every time he left his cell. He would also be moved regularly to prisons all over Britain, a process called ghosting. This is a policy for high-risk prisoners, but it also means visitations are nearly impossible, as he could be moved to any jail in Britain at a moment's notice. In 1989, he was declared the UK's most moved prisoner. On occasion, he was also strapped down to a wheelchair like Hannibal Lecter, or left lying on the floor strapped into a body belt. This is where human rights come into play. Over the years, he has been denied basic human contact, adequate time to exercise, and according to him, has been beaten regularly by guards. He has been housed in a cell devoid of any sunlight or human interaction under constant surveillance. He is allocated 1 hour a day for exercise and 1 hour a week to shower. Quoting from his own words, "In jail, they are watching me every day, like a buzzard watches its prey, and a mongoose watches a cobra, like a spider watches a fly. I'm trapped, caught up in a web." According to psychologist Dr. Bob Johnson, who was sent to study Bronson, he was denied the chance to psychologically help him. The prison system and the Home Secretary blocked him from treating Charlie, completely ruining any chance of rehabilitation. It seems their ideological aim is punishment. Punishment in the most inhumane and cruel ways, which further creates anger and psychosis. Bronson claims at times guards would use psychological tactics to break his willpower. They would wake him up by banging his door, giving him cold food, half servings, and they wouldn't give him toilet roll or soap. He maintains that this treatment just made him madder, more animalistic and violent. He believed he was at war. Bronson also claims that he has walked miles and miles inside prison cells, round and round in circles with nothing to keep him entertained, circling like a lion in a zoo. In his book Bronson, he describes his experience thusly: solitary eats away at a man's soul. Years of loneliness and small cells have left me paranoid about people invading my space. Prison time is dead time, and being in isolation is like being in a coffin. 23 hours a day of nothing but loneliness, fading memories and vague dreams. Much like Riddick in the film Pitch Black, his eyes became adjusted to darkness. He had to wear bright sunglasses when out of his cell because he was so unfamiliar with natural light. With a huge beard, enormous frame and red sunglasses, he looked quite the character. He also draws incredible artwork from his prison cell, surreal and bizarre depictions that portray the barbarism of his confinement and the lunacy of his mind. He has somewhat made up for his misdeeds using his art by selling it and giving the proceeds to charities. In 2014, he legally changed his name to Charles Salvador in recognition of his hero, the surrealist art icon Salvador Dali. He also had a string of female admirers that would write to him. He even got married and engaged to some of them. In his book Bronson, he admits to wasting his life, but he is also proud of the madness and excitement he has made of a bad situation. In the foreword to his book, he also warns youngsters to stay away from crime, as it is not worth it. He is a paradox of a character, capable of ruthless violence but yet extremely caring and empathetic. He is accustomed to a life of suffering and cannot bear to see others in pain. He has shown great kindness and compassion to prisoners, which many ex-cons can attest to. In 2002, Bronson did an interview for a documentary about Mad Frankie Fraser. He said all he wants when he gets out is an apple pie.
Yeah, when I get out, buy me a nice apple pie, 'cause I do love an apple pie. When I smell an apple pie, I go all funny inside. I love an apple pie. There's something about it.
He seemingly had his last hurrah at 65 when he covered himself in butter and fought 12 guards when he wasn't allowed a visit from his then wife on Valentine's Day, at least according to the Daily Mail. But for those that don't know, the Daily Mail are not a reputable source, so take that with a pinch of salt. That same year, he was proven not guilty of GBH against the governor of Wakefield. Bronson, now 67, holds out for a last glimmer of hope for freedom. He is once again up for parole, and it looks like he may have more chance of freedom than ever before. He is currently fighting to have his parole hearing heard in public to eliminate any unfair treatment. He has a fair amount of supporters campaigning for his release. In 2013, 10,000 people signed a petition for his release. The case is certainly a moral conundrum. Nature versus nurture. He certainly had all the characteristics of psychopathy before he went to prison, but the beatings and isolation harnessed the worst parts of his psyche. They inspired him to do damage, and in truth they gave him justification for the harm he inflicted. The prison system helped create the violent madman he became and punished him for it. In part, the state has created this unmanageable monster. In some ways, because of this, he is owed freedom. But where can he go? He is now an old man. Despite his tremendous fitness and stellar physique, he is an old man. An old man with severe paranoia and violent tendencies. Because of this and his isolation, it would be both unfair and unsafe to release him on the street cold turkey. He needs a place of rehabilitation to show him how to live on the outside world. But is it fair to place a potentially dangerous person with other, presumably vulnerable people? I say, as an old man, he deserves his chance. He has served more years than anyone in the UK, and his charges are a lot less worrying than some of the minuscule sentences certain types of people get for the worst types of crimes imaginable. The world will be a very different place to him if he is released. And Charles Bronson, who is a very traditional man, may hate what he comes out to. In terms of moral degeneracy, he may become disgusted and may regret ever coming back out. This is the danger zone. His institutionalization may lead him to want to go back to jail by any means necessary. But for me, the risk is worth taking. He has served time harder than anything I can imagine, and I feel that he is owed his final years in freedom.
It's looking good for me. I could be out there 2021. If not, defo 2022. I'm on my way, son. We'll have a nice Guinness together, a nice fry up, talk about the old days,